This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the M113 C&R vehicle, or to the Royal Netherlands Army, the C and V variant of the M113. Many of you will know it by its Canadian name in service, and that's the Lynx. And I'm going to call it the Lynx most of this tank chat because this is the version, the Canadian version, that we actually have here at the Tank Museum.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
Now, if you take you back to the beginning of the 1960s, the Americans have built the M113, the famous armoured personnel carrier that's going into service as an APC. They've got to go alongside it. A rival company has built another vehicle. The M113 is built by the Food Machinery Corporation, or what changes its name a couple of times, Food Machinery and Chemical Corporation, which later becomes United Defence. They've come up with the M113 and they're the main producers of it, and they produce a huge number over time. But a rival company under General Dynamics actually comes up with what the Americans are looking for in terms of a reconnaissance vehicle, and they actually end up looking fairly similar. That's the M114. But the M114 has a trouble beginning, it's not particularly successful in service, and it's removed from service relatively early on. A number of countries who are looking at the M113 also look at the M114. It's not picked up by anybody else. Now, the Food Manufacturing Corporation, they realise there's a bit of a gap in the market here. So as a private venture, they come up with a version of their M113 that could be used for reconnaissance and scouting and as a command vehicle. And how they do that is they basically shorten the length of the M113. They end up lowering the height. They put the engine instead of the front, they put it into the back, and they take out a wheel station, so there's only actual 4 wheel stations as opposed to 5. And that means that weight comes down to about 8 tonnes from the 11 tonnes that the M113 normally has. And of course it makes it a smaller vehicle, which is attractive because it's harder to see, harder to hit, lighter. And in the early sales literature, the FMC Corporation are basically saying this is not only amphibious, you know, we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's also air portable and air droppable. They were actually suggesting you could parachute this relatively light vehicle as part of airborne landings, etc. Now, that vehicle was trialled by the US Army. They don't accept it into service because they do have the M113 they go on with for a while. But it is looked at by other nations, and the 2 countries that actually pick it up and put it into service. The first country is the Dutch. They end up buying about 250 of them, and they put them into service the first ones go into service in '66 for the Royal Netherlands Army. The other country that trials and looks at it is actually Canada, and they end up in 1968. They put about 174 of them into service, and they see service for the following decades. So both of those countries, actually there's slight variations with the Dutch one, but this is one of those ones that was actually used by the Canadian military. So we'll look at this, and this was kind of considered the standard. It looks much more like the original Lynx that was put out in the sales literature. Sometimes you'll see early days as well. It goes through a number of name changes, and you'll see them referred to. Actually, we've got a number of trials report here. Even the British Army trialled and looked at the vehicle, one of the prototypes, and looking at the reports there, there's different names are given at certain times, including one that was called M113.5. That wasn't any official designation, but you can see the way that why they've picked up on that, because it looked like it's a half or a smaller vehicle than the original M113. So looking at the vehicle, as I've mentioned, the engine's in the back. What we've got again is that GMC 6V53. It's about a 215 horsepower engine. It's a Detroit diesel. They're obviously building on the success of the M113, using many of the same transmission components. And that's tied up with a TX100 Allison transmission. Drive goes to the front. The differentials this time are at the front of the vehicle, engine at the rear, as opposed to the M113 that way. access to the engine, top decks at the rear, and there's actually a hatch that opens on the rear side as well, that opens sideways. And in a lot of the reports, one of the things that's mentioned, all of them say about maintenance access is very good to keep that vehicle going. So that was considered a major plus point. The drives go through a front drive sprocket. Tracks again are the same as on the M113, and as I mentioned, only 4 double wheel stations this time, and it's torsion bar suspension. Again, lots of the ideas taken straight across from the M113 vehicle. Now, I mentioned the word amphibious. Again, if you're scouting and reconnaissance, that idea of crossing waterways, lakes, inland waterways, you won't go on the open sea with this, but the idea is you drop forward on the front there, there's a trim vane, that's positioned forward, so it just basically breaks any bow wave of water from coming up and over the top of the vehicle, flooding the engine or going inside. There's a bilge pump inside to pump out any water that may have made ingress into the vehicle when you're going along. You can go about 4 or 5 miles an hour across flat waterways with a relatively little preparation. There's some covers for some of the vents on the rear engine deck that you might have to arrive that way or put in place first of all. If you read the reports about usage, quite often smaller waterways, obviously they do like a lot of vehicles, they just speed through it and hope they get through to the other side without too much in the way of preparation. Propulsion, by the way, is just the tracks, just the way they go through the water. They'll scoop up enough water in their motion forward, and that means you'll get across inland waterways. In terms of the armament they put on the vehicle, they're looking at this to have a 3-man crew, and there is actually a different configuration between the Dutch or the Royal Netherlands Army vehicles and the Canadian ones, and that's how they actually position the crews in there. In the Canadian version, or the standard Lynx as it were, you can see the drivers on the other side. The main armament is a 50 caliber Browning machine gun that's put on this M26. Sometimes it's referred to as a turret, sometimes a cupola, but that's where the commander is. And there's a third crew member who would sometimes be called the observer or radio operator. He's actually got his own hatch as well at the back of the vehicle, and they would sometimes put a 30 caliber Browning on there. One of the things the Royal Netherlands Army did with their vehicle as an improvement, in May of 1974, they ordered up over 260 of the Oerlikon, what they call it's a KBAB. It's a 25mm cannon on a remote weapon station, and that is actually fitted to all of their fleet of CV vehicles, the M113 CV fleet as they call it, and that gives it that extra punch and firepower in their service. Now for this main 50 caliber armament, the idea is that the commander can fire it by using a manual traverse and mechanism inside, hatch open, he can still have all-round 360 traverse with that weapon that way. And again, from the point of view on that M26 sort of version there, you've actually got about 8 vision blocks going around the top there. And in a number of the reports where people were trialling the vehicle, they point out the fact actually this is a very good level of vision, especially for people like the Royal Canadian Army and the British Army. When they were looking at the vehicle, they always compare it to the Ferret, which they had in service at the time. So in terms of closed down visibility, this was very good to a closed down Ferret, and that of course is mentioned in the trials reports. Smoke discharges on the front, 2 wings there, again different variations were put on in terms of smoke discharges. Driver has periscopic sighting when he closes down, and would have an infrared driver's sight in the actual hatch would be put there for night driving or use for infrared driving that way. Lights at the front, infrared as well as white lights. Rubber track guards along the side. These could be removed to make that vehicle just that little bit thinner for part of its air transportability role, so that the idea you can get around the place a lot easier that way. But these are rubber covers for the to keep dust and also some form of protection to the track system here. So armour protection on the vehicle is made of aluminium, just like the M113. It's just over about 3 centimetres thick aluminium. That will stop small arms fire, some shell fragments, blast effect, etc., but not much else than that. So again, this idea with a small, very mobile vehicle, your best protection is really not being seen in the first place, or your speed if you are seen. And for that end, a vehicle like this, you can get up to about 44 miles an hour on the open road, so about 70-something kmh. So that's quite a nippy vehicle for doing that type of thing. Also, in terms of load, you've got about 303 litres of fuel there on the vehicle, which gives you a range of just over 520 kilometres. So you've got a pretty good range there as well, which of course for scouting, reconnaissance, disappearing off into the distance, that sort of thing is quite an important thing to bear in mind. Now, one of the other things that both the British, when they trialled it in the trial report, they mentioned the fact, and I've just got to quote this one, for the Canadians, they think it's recommended, they're saying the FMC Commander Reconnaissance Vehicle considered acceptable and preferred over the M14A1 vehicle for use as a scout vehicle in the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps. The British, rather wryly, say is once they've looked at this, they actually again think it's a good one, but they also come out with this line: the amount of space available to the crew and the good entry and escape hatches as under their commendable design features, they say this can only be described as luxurious compared to a three-man ferret. And of course, the early ferrets with the Mark 1s with the top on, you know, you can sometimes squeezing three-man crew. Normally, we always think of them as two-man driver and commander with the turreted versions. You know, they are very, very tight for space. In turn, if you read Canadians and some of the Dutch reports on these vehicles when they're in service later on, the crews, what at the time was considered a spacious interior, the crews are saying it's still pretty tight in there for a three-man crew. So as I've said, you've got your radios in there. All three of those crew can operate the main radio, so if it's sending messages back, but normally that observer, radio operator, that's his dedicated task normally. But once you're there, again, some of the accounts saying about, you know, if you actually took full stowage with you, it's a very, very tight space. If you're taking everything you're due to take, including ammunition, etc., spares, which is why, again, like with so many vehicles, you'll see quite a bit of kit, sometimes rearranged on the outside of the vehicle to do all that. Now, I mentioned, so the Royal Netherlands Army had them into service. They ended up withdrawing them, really. They've still got some in reserve, as it were, but some of those got passed on. There's now 35 in service with Bahrain. There's about 8 in service out now with Chile that were passed on by the Dutch. The Canadian ones were taken out of service, replaced by an M113 variant for a short time, and then they went over for wheeled recce, and so they got Coyote and part of that LAV family of vehicles going into for reconnaissance service that way. It's one of those vehicles that, again, because it's still in service, when you think about it, for a vehicle designed way back at the beginning of the 1960s, long service life, but simple, reliable, and because it's based around that M113 family in terms of things such as spare parts, all sorts of things going around that way, actually it means it's a very easily sustainable vehicle, and as long as those aluminium hulls can keep going, really you can't see any particular reason why, for example, Chile or Bahrain is going to actually be taking that to service anytime soon. Still functional, still has a role that way in terms of any sort of small mobile armour that will protect the crew. So an interesting vehicle, one of those vehicles, you can see it's here, it's a bit dusty, dirty over here in our workshop shed. That's because it's a regular runner here at the museum. We'll have it out quite often as part of our displays to show that role of a reconnaissance vehicle, and it's kept going. You know, I came here in 2000, it's been running pretty much every season since, so back to that idea of the reliability, and I think it's just about due another service here in our workshops so that it can keep running again into the future, and you'll be able to come along here and hopefully be seeing it running for many years to come.